I have terrible news. You're going to have to square up your quilt again. I use my quilting ruler to get a nice corner, and then I follow the guide to continue up the quilt. Everybody in year 2022 has a tube of Clorox wipes. It makes a great template for a rounded corner. Using a water-soluble pen or a disappearing ink, I draw around the curve and cut along the line. Rounded corners give this organic quilt a little softness. This is the fabric that I'm going to use for my edge binding that will go all the way around my quilt. Now, in order to create a binding, we need to create strips of fabric that we can sew together that will fit all the way around the circumference of the quilt. Now, the strips need to be cut at 2.5 inches, and then they'll be folded in half. We'll iron them, and then we'll attach them to the quilt. I'll show you all of that. I'm gonna line this up, and I'm going to use 2.5 inches. Put that here. I'm using my board to find the 2.5. And I have my first strip. Now this top part, we can square that up as well. I'll do that all at the end. You may want to cut your strips to the longest part of the fabric that you have. Now, if you have a short ruler, you might find it easier to do the other way. And certainly I've made quilts and seen quilts that have strips of really all different sizes that come together to make the binding. And it's very unnoticeable. When your strips are squared up, you'll sew them together. This one is not square, but imagine it is. And we'll sew a line right here, and that will create longer strips. We are on the home stretch of making this totally unique quilt. I've ironed my binding. See how it's folded in half. And to make our edge of our quilt, we're going to start the binding, start sewing it on in the middle of our quilt. So pick any side and go in the middle. Doesn't have to be exact. And we're going to be attaching it. Now you'll want to give yourself a little bit of room, and maybe the more inexperienced you are, the more extra you give yourself. And the reason why is we're going to sew this on, and we're going to pull it. We're going to go all the way around the quilt, and then we're going to meet it back at the spot. So we're going to need a little wiggle room to be able to get those together smoothly. Now we'll attach it raw side to raw side. We'll be placing it here. The seam will go right here. And then we'll be folding it all the way over and sewing it on the other side. Now let's get started. We're leaving that extra, putting raw side to raw side. I'm using a walking foot right here because that's really what I'm most comfortable with using. But there are a number of different kinds of feet you can use for this. I got really excited about putting the binding on, so I went around my corner without pins or clips. Make sure to use pins or clips. It makes it so much easier. So we have the two ends with lots of slack and the space in between, and you could have given yourself a little bit more space. I've done this before. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna decide where do you want that seam to be? And it can really be anywhere in the middle. I think right here looks pretty good. Make sure you're not pulling on the fabric at all. And I'm gonna make a mark right there. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Just clipping the insides together. And then then there you go. If you mess up and it doesn't lay flat, mine's laying pretty nice, but if it doesn't lay flat, you can take this out and try again because you haven't cut this yet. A lot of people will measure their seam allowance and do this, but organic quilt. This is how I do stuff. So there you go. You can cut this off and then sew the rest of your seam. So I've cut that extra off. I've folded it in nicely, lining it up. Your binding is attached. Sewing on the binding by hand is my favorite part of the quilting process. You're going to fold over the binding, lining it up with your seam. Use clips to secure it. I don't usually clip the entire quilt, but I just do a little bit at a time. While you're working on this, you can sit on your couch using your quilt as a blanket, sewing one stitch at a time. To start the stitch, I cut a length of thread and I tie a knot at the end. I put the needle right into the stitch line and through the edge of the binding. Directly below where the thread came out, I push the needle through the stitch line again and right up into the binding, closing it together. Use your clips to help hold everything while you're getting started. Directly under into the stitch line and up into the edge of the binding. Treat the rounded corners just as you have on the straight edges. Use your clips to secure and take it a little bit at a time. I find the rounded corners are actually easier than hand stitching a 90-degree angle corner. You'll do this all the way around your quilt until your totally unique organic quilt is finished. Don't be intimidated by this curve. You've already proved you can sew great curves. This corner will be no problem. If you've made the organic quilt or are having any troubles, reach out to me on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at Kirbi Fagan. Likes and subscribes are always appreciated. Until next time.